Good afternoon, everyone. If you are in Brazil local time or North America, Latin America time, and good evening if you're in Europe. And thanks for everyone from Europe that are joining us a little later in the day. My name is Konstantinos Stylianou. I'm a professor of competition law at the University of Glasgow and a member of CREATE. CREATE is the Center for Regulation of the Creative Economy, based at the University of Glasgow, but serving the entire UK. And we've put an exciting panel for you together this day. It's the third panel of the Competition Innovation Conference that is kindly organized by the Brazilian Institute for Competition and Innovation. So together on this panel, we would be exploring competition innovation in the creative economies. And we are joined today by four panelists. I am going to introduce the panelists, and I am going to just very briefly state what their intervention is about at the outset, so that then we can just go ahead and listen to the four interventions, one right after the other, without me interrupting. So we're going to start with Amy. Amy Thomas is a lecturer in intellectual property and information law at the University of Glasgow, and of course a member of CREATE. And she's going to talk to us about a social legal approach to regulating user creativity in video games, mainly through terms of service and other private ordering mechanisms. We also have Christopher Erickson, who is a professor of social data science and the deputy director of CREATE. And his presentation is going to be on generative artificial intelligence and zero marginal content. Does it represent a coming wave of disruption? We also have with us Aline Iramina, who is a PhD student and a lecturer in law at the University of Glasgow, and also a member of CREATE, but also a civil servant in Brazil's federal government, but currently on leave from that position. And she is going to present a paper called Paving the Way for the Right to Research Platform Data, which has been co-authored with Mayan Terrell and Professor Niva Elkin-Koren. And then lastly, we are also joined by Stavros Makris. Stavros, I left you last because you joined late, but Stavros is our flying wizard in residence. And I'm happy to have him on the panel. He is also a lecturer in competition law at the University of Glasgow and another member of CREATE's wonderful team. And he's going to talk about what kind of innovation the Digital Markets Act seek to protect or promote. Okay, and with that, I think that I can pass the floor to Amy. Amy, aim to speak for about 15-20 minutes so that we can leave a little bit of time for questions at the end of the panel. I'm going to mute my microphone, but I will be actively monitoring the chat if anyone has any comments. So feel free to let me know of any problems or comments or thoughts. And Amy, you are up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Konstantinos. And I've just started sharing my screen, so I hope people can see it. I think I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you. So I thought I would take this opportunity today to present my project You Can Play, which is about video game user-generated content policies and exploring all the ways, I guess, people are allowed to be sort of innovative and strange with game content. So the big disclaimer is that first and foremost, I'm a copyright scholar. I'm not based in competition law. And whilst the drive to look at this area has mainly been kind of stimulated by copyright and contract interests, there might be some competition related implications to the research that I would really be curious to hear about. So I'll start us. So this was initially an impact project that was funded by the ESRC Impact Acceleration Account, which in turn was born out of some of my doctoral thesis work, and now I'm trying to return to a more kind of academic angle. So you can access a beta version of the digital resource that I built on copyrightevidence.org/YCP. There's also a working paper that you can read on the Create website, and there's an open access paper via the Internet Policy Review, which was just published in 2023. So any and all feedback or thoughts, commentary is welcome on any of those. So You Can Play was born because, as I say, I'm interested in the weird and wonderful things that people do with video games. This all broadly kind of falls under the heading of user-generated content, or UGC, for the purposes of this discussion. So on the slides here, most people will probably be familiar with game streaming. So basically watching other people play games, which I would suggest now is probably better understood as an influential user industry. There's game personalities who play games and are watched by millions of people and potentially make millions in return for that via ad revenue or donations on platforms like YouTube or Twitch. UGC can also take the form of some fan works, so taking inspiration from the game world or characters to make art or fictional stories. I picked here, I think, the kind of nightmarish vision of Among Us reimagined as a retro arcade game poster, just here in the centre of the slides as an example of that. And another fun example that I found was game photography, which is becoming increasingly professionalised. So as games are getting sort of bigger and more beautiful and intricate, there's lots of these sort of technical game photography options, and companies are actually hiring now for this skill set. So Rockstar North in Edinburgh, which is just up the road for us Scottish people, was just recently hiring a game photographer. This one here is just an example from Cyberpunk that I thought was particularly pleasing. And I think all of these are sort of interesting and important forms of innovation, often kind of overlooked either because of the cultural lowbrow that's still sort of associated with video games, or maybe because of its dubious legal status. And in this research, I'm kind of curious about what we can learn about the system that makes all of this possible, because, as I'm about to explain, it's definitely not because of copyright, despite in principle being the law that grants a monopoly to encourage innovation. Because in fact, I think for the copyright scholar, the existence of all of these sorts of activities and using other people's work is a bit of a puzzle, because our legal framework isn't very supportive of it. Copyright is by default all rights reserved. It's in principle restrictive. And in my work, I argue that most of these sort of user activities, unless explicitly permitted by the rights holder, are likely to be copyright infringement. But I think what's also sort of implied here is that there is a bit of a reciprocity with user-generated content. It feeds from, but it also feeds into the game industry. And I think there is a relationship between the way people reuse content and the value to the primary game product. So Rocket League, for example, was this tiny, unheard of little game by an independent developer that's now a worldwide esport after it was picked up by some popular Twitch streamers. So there is a capacity here, I think, for users to sort of repurpose a game and make or break its success. And I think there's a distinction between the sort of experiential nature of a game as a primary product, so buying a game to play it, versus repurposing a game as an observer or an user-generated content, which in itself I think is quite innovative. So for this reason, you'll find that actually, rather than relying on the default law of copyright, a lot of game companies now are using this almost kind of Creative Commons style system of voluntary licensing, with developers and publishers permitting lots of these user activities through user-generated content policies. So user contracts or declarations that set the parameters of what the game creator will and won't tolerate. And this is what I was kind of curious about researching. So I created a data set based on 30 popular game titles. Cumulatively, that's 61 different kind of user-orientated contracts that set the parameters of what people can and can't do with game content. There's some kind of limitations to be aware of. In particular, there's no mobile games in this data set, which is a bit of an omission given the size of that sort of subsector. And there's also a kind of US skew in the data set as well. So you'll find that games, whilst they're maybe developed in certain countries, so the UK in particular, we develop a lot of games, they're published and owned usually by a US corporate, and they set the sort of parameters of what you can and can't do with a game, and that might have some influence here on what is and isn't allowed. And then I coded iteratively from the text the most sort of prevalent types of user-generated content activities, and I came up with this scope of 8 different activities, which I'll show in a moment, either based on whether they were allowed with conditions, or whether they were outright prohibited. And then in the digital tool that we made as well, we kind of created this system of restrictiveness scoring, where basically on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 meaning nothing's allowed, 100 meaning everything's allowed, we could see how restrictive certain companies were based on what they do or do not permit in relation to their game content. So here's some of the findings. First off, you'll see that videos, even though I'd say they're one of the most kind of problematic things in the copyright context, are actually the most straightforward when it comes to user-generated content policies. The message here, I think, is very clear. It's, stream us, put us on Twitch and YouTube, make us the next Rocket League. Fan works, by contrast, are a wee bit more muddied here. They have the most sort of conditions attached. I think this might be a consequence of my own coding, because I've lumped everything together as fan works, whereas actually companies tend to be much more nuanced in terms of allowing maybe fan art, but not fan fiction, or vice versa. Fan games are usually widely prohibited. So there's lots of kind of conditions and intricacies depending on the quality of the work you're making. Some more kind of interesting observations, mods, so the ability to kind of modify or edit a game code to change the way that it looks or behaves, is something that in copyright scholarship's written about quite extensively as a sort of tolerated user industry. But in most of the contracts that I looked at, they were outright prohibited. Again, I think this might be a byproduct of the data set, especially as games are more online and multiplayer and networked. Mods can jeopardize fair play. So I think that as we see this sort of move towards integration to cloud-based systems and online networks, we'll probably see a more restrictive approach to things like modding, where there's a security concern, I guess, to accessing the code. Game soundtracks as well is much more muddied compared to things like video, which I think confirms the suspicion that we see a lot in copyright research, that music is almost of its own and is completely separate to other aspects of the game. So much more permissive about videos, but not so much about the audio that accompanies it. And it seems to be because a lot of the game companies don't own the audio that they're actually including in their games, and they're licensed with a third party. And some of them are kind of very explicit in saying, look, this is very complicated. If you're interested in using the audio with this game, look at the credits and contact the person yourself, because we don't know what to do or what we're allowed to say. So it's a bit of a muddier area. You can also see that for the most part, a lot of companies are usually happy for their users to monetize content, so to actually make some profit off of what it is that they're streaming or what it is that they're selling through their fan content. I've decided to make this distinction between monetization and commercial use, because within the context, it seems that the contracts, it seemed kind of textually that distinction was important. So the permission to monetize, as in the sort of passive income that's generated from things like ad revenue or user subscriptions, is quite common, more common actually than letting you use the soundtrack to a game, whereas commercial use is much, much more narrowly and prohibitively sort of understood. But specifically, games companies are not happy about their content being used in relation to commerce. So in theory, it would be okay for you to stream a game for as long as you like and make millions from it from ad revenue, but it wouldn't be okay for a company to use a game character in an advertisement. So in some ways it's more progressive because it acknowledges that users, do something kind of creative here, that they've done something innovative and valuable, and they're willing to have them recompensed for some of that. But when that sort of attitude is disapplied when it comes to a commercial entity. And curiously, quite a lot of the games companies don't allow the use of Patreon or other payment services. Monetization has to be sort of purely passive. And I'm not exactly clear on why this is. That's an unanswered question from the project. I think that screenshots and the treatment of merch are also possibly related, and I think this has to do with the sort of branding around a game rather than the kind of copyright quality. We're almost in more trademark territory here. So screenshots, for example, are kind of surprisingly more restrictively treated than videos, even though in principle a game's just made up of a series of frames of static images. And I think this is specifically to prevent the sort of treatment of a static graphic work in a way that can be divorced from the context of a game. So it's the difference between, I guess, playing Mario and putting Mario's picture on a t-shirt and selling it. But it also invites the sort of game photography problem because screenshots seem to have a different value from the video itself. And I think this is also reflected possibly in the very restrictive approach to merchandise. So people who are looking to make, I guess, t-shirts or blankets or knitted toys or whatever that are based off of game characters. Again, it can be divorced from the original context of the game, and it's probably in more of a sort of direct competition with the primary game product if they are making merchandise to accompany their game. And I guess all in all, the picture here is that depending on how users reconfigure game assets and at what point they're charged access for that directly feeds into whether it's okay for that user to be recompensed for their user-generated content. There's definitely distinctions to be made here. And I think these factors might also help explain some of the patterns that we see. For example, a lot of the Japanese companies here, so Sony, Konami, Capcom, and Nintendo all score very low when it comes to their degree of permissiveness, which I found curious initially because Japan is kind of known as the home of like fan communities. But if the value of branding and merchandise is paramount, then Japan is a cluster of a sort of branding paradise where games are concerned. So Nintendo has Mario and Pokemon. Capcom they were the former owner of Pac-Man. Konami has Silent Hill. And likewise, you see that there's a kind of scale of permissiveness where the larger, more established companies like Sony, Konami's kind of video game royalty, are much more restrictive compared to actually smaller independent companies, despite on the face of it maybe not being able to take the same financial risks. So Superhot are developers of just a kind of one-shot title. They're a very small company based in Europe. And Mojang are the creators of Minecraft. So again, they started off as an independent company and they've sort of kept that ethos of, I guess, kind of liberal content usage, as opposed to some of the bigger companies that we see like Sony, Konami, Capcom, Nintendo. But then again, it might also be an imperfect finding because now I think of it, Minecraft in terms of Mojang is also a huge merchandising opportunity. So there may be a bit of a more unpacking to do there. And then this is the last slide. Just if we're thinking more progressive treatment with a view to innovation, I guess, there's a couple of things I think we can learn from You Can Play. So branding, I think, is almost more important than copyright in this case. So I went in expecting to see sort of copyright concerns and I came out thinking more about trademark. So there's a difference definitely between the kind of experiential play and observed sort of repurposed play and also sort of commercializing an asset that can be divorced from the game world, where there's a sort of substitution effect risk with some types of user-generated content. So there's no substitution effect where I can never play a scary game because I'm just too scared, but I'm quite happy to watch someone play it and at least have the goodwill from that. Whereas there is a direct substitution effect for things like merchandise. And I think that the nuance that we see in the differences between monetization and commercialization, this acknowledgement in the video games industry that in some cases it's okay for a user to be recompensated for their work, actually provokes a bit of a bigger question about whether this is user-generated content at all, or actually is someone being innovative and is, in the eyes of the law, otherwise an author that's entitled to exclusive rights and a monopoly in and of itself. So I think those are potentially the two big questions here. Whether they're relevant for a competition crowd, I'm not quite sure, but I'll certainly be curious to know. So I'm just going to thank everyone that helped me get here, and I'm very happy to hear any feedback or comments or criticisms that you might have about the work. So I hope I'm to time. I've tried to keep it succinct.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. Well, I mean, the content was brilliant, but the presentation also very, very unique. So that was very refreshing to see actually. I was thinking that, Vinicius, was that a hand up?
Oh, sorry. No.
Okay, good.
Mistake.
I don't see any questions in the chat, which makes me want to remind everyone that if you have any comments or thoughts or questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. So unless there are any burning questions from either the attendees or any of the panelists, what we can do is move on with the rest of the presentations, give the people a little more time to think about what they've just heard, and then come back and have a nice discussion at the end of the panel. You know, kind of like try to synthesize everything. I don't see any questions in the chat or any hands up, so I am inclined to move on to Aline. Are you okay with being second? Okay, are you ready? Perfect, great. So yeah, I'm gonna mute myself again and go.
Okay, just 1 minute, let me just share my screen. Okay, close this. You can all see my slides, yeah? Let's see. Can you hear me? Am I muted? Let me. Okay, can I start? Good.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, first of all, hi everyone. Boa tarde a todos. Well, as a member of CREATE and also Brazilian, it's a pleasure to be here talking to this event organized by the Brazilian Institute for Competition and Innovation. As you will see, my presentation is not directly related to competition law. I'm not a competition law researcher or anything, or even to the regulation research of creative industry, but I think it's important for all of those who are interested in researching online platforms, which I believe it's the case of many people here. So what I'm going to present is a paper I wrote with Dr. Mayim Peru and Professor Niva Elkin-Koren from the University of Tel Aviv, where we discuss first the importance of platform data for research, and then how the new EU digital strategy, particularly the Digital Services Act, is adopting new rules to facilitate the access to data for researchers. We also analyzed the potential gaps in these new legislations and the barriers that remain for researchers to access data from platforms in the EU. I guess this is important because, as it's analyzed in our paper, in some ways, it's not clear yet whether researchers from other countries, including from Brazil, for example, might request access to platform data under the DSA. Also, in many countries, such as the US, but also Brazil, there are bills under discussions in the Congress, such as the fake news bill in Brazil, to adopt similar provisions to those adopted in the DSA. So let's see. Let me change. Okay. So first, we start our paper discussing how the access to platform data can support different types of academic or public interest research, which in our view can be considered the touchstone of a right to research, which is connected in many ways with the right to freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, and the right to information, which is guaranteed in many human rights treaties and also in the EU and the UK Charter of Fundamental Rights. In our paper, we bring many examples of different types of research that rely on platform data, including basic scientific research. For instance, we include examples involving the use of social media data to detect early signs of pending natural disasters, of infectious disease outbreaks, and the increasing use of social networks data in digital health research. This is the case, for example, of this news that we brought about Microsoft. It was a research conducted by Microsoft, who has found cancer clues in data collected in their search queries. Also, we also know that Twitter data has been used to study social capital, political agendas, labor economics, and public health in general. And there are many other examples that we bring in our paper of research using Twitter, Uber, Airbnb, and other platforms' data. So, let's see. In our paper, we also highlight the importance of independent research on the impact of platforms on individuals and society as a whole. As we know, platforms conduct their own research internally. This is an example of the Instagram, actually Meta's research on Instagram harms on young women. However, we also know that this kind of research can be shaped by platforms' commercial interests and may also remain confidential in many cases. So one of the things we argue is that ensuring access to data by independent researchers that are not hired by platforms can enable these researchers to challenge conclusions that are reached by other studies conducted by their own platforms. So finally, we mentioned 3 types of the research. The last one we mentioned is the importance of access to platform data to oversee platform governance and hold digital platforms accountable for the ways they manage and shape human behavior. So for example, we showed that access to data can allow researchers to conduct studies that review persistent inequalities in platforms conduct. The application, one of the examples we bring is actually one research conducted by the Harvard Business School, where they apply scraping techniques to analyze, and that they actually find out that there was some racial discrimination on Airbnb. So one of the things we argue is that this kind of research is important because it can safeguard not only individuals against bias and discrimination, but also protect fundamental rights. However, as we know, there are many barriers to access platform data. And one of the things we discuss our paper is those barriers. We know that platforms, they do not share data easily, not even for the purpose of public interest research. They often rely, for example, on contractual and legal restrictions, for example, such as using their terms of services. They also apply some technical measures like requesting some personal information to create accounts, but also API blocking to restrict others, including researchers, from collecting data from their platforms. As we have many examples actually where these platforms made use of these restrictions to prevent researchers to collect and use their data. One of the most recent ones, and I think famous, probably already heard, is the case involving Facebook or Meta and the NYU cybersecurity project for democracy. In this case, the NYU team, they were studying misinformation in political ads on Facebook. And to collect the data, they asked users to install an ad observer browser extension that allow users to share directly their data with the NYU team. However, in 2021, what happens is that Facebook deactivated the accounts of the team members of the NYU research team. And they accuse the researchers for accessing users' data in violation of Facebook's terms of services and also in violation of the data protection law. A similar event happened also with Algorithm Watch project when they were investigating Instagram newsfeed algorithms in the EU. It happened like 1 year later. And one of the things that I've analyzed is that there are many reasons why platforms they usually restrict the access to data. One of them is, for example, they have business interests. Social media platforms and search engines, especially the large ones, usually offer their service for free. So they expect to generate profits from the data they collect through target advertising, but also selling sometimes this data, or even using data to develop data-driven innovation. So this data also guarantees some competitive advantage in relation to other services. I know that maybe for you that work with competition law, if I'm not wrong, the Digital Markets Act, they have some regulation on that, but in this paper we don't address this. But also one of the other reasons that platforms restrict access to data are that they have some legal, regulatory, and reputation concerns. For example, platforms block the access to data to minimize their legal exposure to risks involving privacy and data protection. We should remember that in Cambridge Analytica scandal involving Meta, the data collected by the company initially had some research purposes. And finally, one of the reasons also is by preventing others to access their data. Platforms, they want to avoid unwanted public and regulatory attention for failing to comply with legal requirements or for harming the public interest. So they aim to restrict oversight and accountability. In this context, one of the things that we argue in our paper is that it's clear the need of some kind of regulatory intervention to support public interest research that depends on the access to platform data. We know that this is a policy discussions that we have observed all over the world, not only in the EU. In the US and in Brazil, there are also bills under discussions to guarantee more access to platform data for researchers. In the US, we have the US Platform Accountability and Transparency Act bill. And in Brazil, we have the PL 2630, the Projeto de Lei, also known as fake news bill. However, in our paper, we focus mainly on the EU, where we have a whole new legal framework for digital and data governance that ensures in different ways better access to platform data for research purposes. So you have different regulations. So not only the Digital Services Act, but you also have the Data Governance Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Platform to Business Regulation. You have the proposals of the Data Act and the AI Act that provides for not only a mandatory data sharing regime and transparency obligations, but they also introduces mechanisms for data reuse and research collaboration, and also facilitate the creation of designated data spaces for research. However, one of the things that we argue is that the access to platform data for research purpose only features very marginally across these different frameworks. So the only one that's very clear in relation to this purpose and establish a mandatory data sharing regime for researchers is the Digital Services Act. And this is one of the reasons why we focus on this particular regime in our paper. So one of the things that the DSAs, everybody discusses is that the DSAs introduced a pioneer regulatory framework intended to facilitate access to data for public interest research. As we all know, Article 40 of the DSA makes it compulsory for very large online platforms and very large online search engines to make data available to vetted researchers after approval of the Digital Services Coordinator. In this case, each country will have their own Digital Services Coordinator, but the Digital Services Coordinator of establishment will usually be the one in Ireland, for at least in terms of data access requests. This is because most of the big techs in Europe are based there. As vetted researchers, the DSA considers not only academics, but also journalists and activists that do public interest research. The DSA also established a procedure, a clear procedure for researchers request access to platform data and what are the roles of each body and everything. There is a new regulatory agency, as already mentioned, this Digital Services Coordinator, which will have one in each member state. And they will be responsible for managing the data access requests. Actually, they have many other competencies and attributions, but this is one of them. And besides, the Article 40 of the DSA also provides for supplementary measures to facilitate research and oversight. For example, this includes transparency obligations. And then we have the new One example is the new DSA transparency database with platforms content moderation information, which was launched, I think, a few weeks ago and has a lot of data that can be used for research. There are also mandatory archive of online ads that some of this platform will have to host. And in Article 40, the DSA also provides for a platform duty to facilitate research. And this is very useful, especially for those who want to collect the data, not only request the data from the platforms. However, one of the things that we see that is, although this new regulation is a milestone in the effort to improve access for researchers, for research purpose at least, it fails to provide what we call a comprehensive legal basis for a right to research. Because as we analyze in our paper, this new regulation focuses mainly on enhancing platform accountability and oversight. So they ignore, in many ways, the other kinds of research, specifically mostly the basic scientific research. So this is one of the things we analyze in our paper. And we see that, so as I said, while there's no doubt that the DSA facilitates and bring many rules that facilitate access to data for research purposes, there are still many gaps and barriers for researchers. So we identified 3 main barriers in our paper. So for example, there are some technical blind spots, or we could say a narrow scope of who can access the data and for what purpose under the new regulation. Second, there is a non-preemptive nature of the regulatory provisions. In other words, there's still some legal loopholes that allow platforms to prevent researchers from access, for example, personal, confidential, and commercially valuable and sensitive data, even for public interest research. And finally, we also mentioned a possible regulatory thicket, or the complexity and great amount of the rules, which often overlap and makes harder for researchers to navigate, understand all these rules, and enjoy their rights. In relation to the technical blind spot, one of the reasons we say is that the DSA seems to prioritize research that enables platform oversight is due to the fact that it narrows than expected. For example, it fails to cover the wide range of independent scientific studies that could be conducted using platform data. One of the reasons we say is that is because the DSA limits access to data to research on systemic risk and risk mitigation measures in the EU. Although this can be interpreted broadly, it's not very clear how they would apply for basic scientific research that use platform data. Also, in terms of the EU, it's not clear when they say that if, for example, researchers from an institution, research institution from other countries would be able to rely on the DSA to request data, even though if the systemic risk is in the EU. Also, the DSA fails to facilitate scientific research that relies on exploratory methods. For example, the DSA requires that researchers inform the objectives of their research, and exploratory research is often dynamic, and its explicit research questions and method may not always be defined at the outset. So as a result, researchers seek to engage in exploratory research may not be able to meet the rigid list of requirements that the DSA imposes on vetted researchers. Also, as we noted, the DSA may even facilitate independent collection of real-time data. This is one of the things that I mentioned a few slides, but only when this data is publicly available and technically possible to collect, and if involves very large online platforms and very large online search engines. In terms of the non-creative nature, we also mentioned as a barrier the platform's ability to override the regulation due to this non-creative nature of the regulatory provisions of the DSA. We know that so far digital services rely on many different kinds of legal and contractual limitations to prevent and restrict access to data, or to limit the use of certain research methods to collect data on their platforms. And the DSA only partly, sorry, someone was knocking here, and the DSA only partly addressed this issue. So for example, although the DSA encourages platforms to provide access to real-time data and cooperate with researchers, the effectiveness of these provisions depends on the extent to which it enforces would allow platforms to contract around it. This is because platforms may still use, for example, some DSA-compatible contractual limitations on data access to protect their commercial interests. So one of the things that we mentioned as an example is platforms, for example, can prohibit automatic collections of public available data that results in violation of their trade secrets.
Aline, sorry to interrupt you, but would you be able to wrap up in a minute or
Yes.
two, because
Yes,
we're nearing the...
this is
Okay.
almost my last slide, sorry.
Okay, cool. Thank
So
you.
in terms of finally, this is the one, and then I have a last one. In terms of the regulatory thicket, we also discussed the major challenge of researchers seek to explore data hosted by digital platforms is that there are numerous legal norms that may apply to each particular use of data. And then that's what we call the regulatory thicket. Not only the DSA, but also the new EU digital legal framework is a highly complex patchwork of laws and rules that may create a barrier for researchers seeking to exercise this newly established right to access platform data. The DSA, for example, only the DSA mentions more than 30 other regulations and directives, EU regulations and directives, and there are also many other codes of conduct and other governance instruments that it proposed to regulate their provisions. So it's expected that these rules will increase. And when we analyze that, there's always the risk of when you have so many laws, standards, rules, there might be some inconsistency between them, which can undermine their applicability and, for example, make easier for platforms to evade regulation. So to end, so this is my last slide. As a way forward, what we conclude is when we propose to address all these limitations, we propose some possible solutions. For example, we propose the expansion of the scope of the DSA to encompass all kinds of independent scientific research in the public interest. So the idea is that EU regulators or legislators adopt a broader approach to this provision. For example, by clarifying that it covers all kinds of independent scientific research in the public interest. We also given the uncertainty that is created by the regulatory thicket and the enforceability of contractual restrictions to data access, we also propose that it's necessary to introduce a safe harbor for public interest research. And we propose something similar to what you already have in the US Platform Accountability Transparency Act bills. So for example, researchers who access and collect platform data for academic, public interest research, they should be able to defend themselves against a contractual claim asserted by platforms, so long they lawfully preserve users' privacy and do not deploy illegal means of access. And finally, there are other alternatives to improve access to data that have been mentioned by other researchers. And we mentioned these codes of conduct and guidelines that clarify some of these rules. And this is it. I'm sorry for being so long. Thank you all. This is a paper that is going to be published in this book, edited by Jeff Oslos and Cedar de Souza, Research Access to Digital Infrastructure. But we also already uploaded in the SSRN, but it's just the first version. The last one will be published in the book. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Alina. Well, both Alina and Amy Thomas were a little defensive as to not having to do anything with competition law. So to make up for that, I am inviting Stavros Makris to take the floor and talk to us about, well, this time the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, instead of the DSA, about which we've heard so far. So Stavros, I see that your presentation is
fantastic.
Already up. We can,
so
yeah.
You can see my slides, right?
I can, yeah, we can see the slides. They're not in full screen yet, but
okay.
You're good to go. And try to keep it to about like 15 minutes if possible.
I will. Let me put
All
my
right,
slide
thank you
here.
very much. Muting myself.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the kind invite. Thanks a lot to the organizers and to Konstantinos for chairing and for introducing me in a cooler way than a competition lawyer. So it's a great pleasure to be here for a second consecutive year. And in my 15 minutes, I'll be talking to you about a question that keeps us awake at night. Is DMA killing or promoting innovation? So let me start with a few words about competition law, because DMA came as an attempt to solve us from the shortcomings and perhaps the failures of competition law enforcement. So competition law is the birth child of the economy of the tangibles, where manufacturing, let's say, was the primary sector in the economy. Maximizing output and driving prices down were the main concerns of the competitive process. And for this reason, competition analysis is underlined by the so-called perfect competition model, according to which the main problem when it comes to monopolies, the primary evil, let's say, in this setting is the deadweight loss, so the yellow triangle that you can see here, and the wealth transfer that consumers have the wealth transfer through the higher prices that consumers have to pay to the monopolist due to the increased market power. And of course, you can already notice that both evils of the monopoly are measured in terms of output and prices, so in terms of static efficiency. So now as we transition to the economy of the intangibles, the knowledge economy, which is in a constant state of permanent innovation, and where we are concerned about large-scale production in combination with customization of products and permanent innovation, we see that the fundamental parameters of competition are changing, and dynamic efficiency might be much more important than static efficiency. So now competition authorities and courts are struggling with the difficult trade-offs between static efficiency and dynamic efficiency. How are we supposed to treat an agreement, a merger, or a unilateral behavior that generates certain static inefficiencies? For instance, it leads to price increases, but simultaneously is accompanied by dynamic efficiency gains. So this question hinges upon our understanding of the relationship between competition and innovation. So any attempt to regulate digital markets or innovation-driven markets, or to apply competition law, is also permeated by our understanding of innovation and its relationship with competition. And there we are facing some reasonable disagreement. So there are theories, for instance, Schumpeter, that claim that monopoly profits and monopoly positions are what actually drives innovative activity, and monopoly profits are actually the inducement to the risk-taking activity that is attached to innovative efforts. So according to this kind of thinking, digital ecosystems can promote innovation because they compete for the market, they secure monopoly positions, and then they can further invest. However, there is doubt about the merits of this kind of theories. So Arrow is one of the most prominent representatives of the opposite view. So according to Arrow, monopolists tend to be lazy because of the displacement and cannibalization effects that can generate from their monopoly position. For instance, I don't have any real incentives to innovate if I know that the new product will cannibalize on the profits of my existing products as a monopolist. So according to Arrow, neck-to-neck competition, intensified competition is what drives innovation. And then we see theories that try to reconcile these two conflicting approaches. For instance, Agion and others claim that intense competition and relatively deconcentrated markets drive innovation to a certain extent, but after that, we need also we need to combine this with concentrated market structures or oligopolistic market structures that allow the market players to appropriate their innovative efforts. Other theories that further built on this are Sapiros and Bowles and others. So the basic point there is that companies invest in, companies engage in innovative activity as long as they can contest each other's sales based on innovation. So contestability is a factor that drives innovation, and this echoes very much Arrow's approach, whereas also it's not contestability, but also appropriability. So the capacity, the ability of the companies to appropriate their investment through, for instance, IP rights or monopoly rents could be another important driver of innovation. So these are more up-to-date approaches that try to reconcile Schumpeter and Arrow, and in a sense, excuse me, before that, in a sense, forge a link between competition and innovation. So in this setting, the DMA came with the explicit purpose to inject fairness and contestability in digital markets. So the DMA is particularly concerned about digital gatekeepers, and the concern of the Commission behind that is that digital gatekeepers control the flow of innovation, appropriate rents, preclude other rivals from engaging in innovative activity, and as a result, the observed levels of innovation are suboptimal. So then, on this basis, we can look at the obligations of the DMA and identify or question whether these kind of obligations promote or undermine innovation, and what kind of innovation. So this is the main purpose of the exercise today. So on the one hand, DMA explicitly seeks to promote fairness, and it understands fairness as contractual imbalance between the gatekeeper and the different users, be that business users or end users. Why is that relevant for innovation? There is a link with innovation, and it can be found in recital 33, because according to DMA, if market participants are precluded from adequately capturing the benefits from their innovative activity, then they will be not encouraged or allowed to engage in innovation. So the concern here is that gatekeepers can exploit their superior bargaining position and prevent their rivals from capturing the benefits of their own contributions, and this can stagnate innovation. And how does the DMA promote innovation through fairness obligations? A few examples can help illustrate this point. So, for instance, DMA prohibits gatekeepers from engaging in anti-steering. Therefore, the hidden assumption behind this rule could be that Apple will be able to directly interact and transact with users. Spotify, excuse me. Spotify could be directly able to transact with users. Therefore, users will not have to pay a 30% commission to the App Store. By appropriating this kind of value, Spotify will be able to sustain its business or further innovate. So this is one way that the DMA, by focusing on the contractual imbalance between the parties, seeks to promote innovation. Another set of obligations revolve around consumer empowerment. So if consumers can use their data more effectively, if, for instance, also the apps the apps interoperate, so consumers are more empowered, they will be more able to allow new players enter the market and more freely express their preferences. And this, of course, the hidden assumption is that will incentivize new startups, nascent competitors, to enter the market. Then fairness is one key pillar of the DMA. The second is contestability. So, and there we see also in the base of the previous discussion that the DMA takes a clear stance closer towards Arrow or Baumol that contestability is a particularly important driver of innovation. And the DMA defines contestability as the ability of companies to effectively overcome the barriers that the gatekeepers pose. And it is concerned, this regulation is concerned about both inter-platform and intra-platform contestability. So if, for instance, there is weak inter-platform contestability, maybe by intensifying intra-platform contestability and giving opportunities through obligations to rivals or nascent competitors to compete and reach consumers, innovation will be promoted. This is the underlying assumption. And here my point is that the DMA obligations could be understood as promoting both incremental innovation and disruptive innovation. By that I mean, when I refer to incremental innovation, I refer to doing things better, and disruptive innovation is doing better things. So let me now just give you a few examples to sustain this point. So, for instance, the prohibition of self-preferencing or obligations to grant access, but also duties to interoperate or to enhance data interoperability contain gatekeeper power, and in that way are supposed to promote incremental, sustaining innovation. And this can be particularly beneficial for consumers, but here we see that the DMA is very much in line with competition law enforcement. For instance, the Microsoft case was actually an attempt to promote incremental and sustaining innovation. Now, there are obligations, or the same set of obligations can also promote disruptive innovation. So can create opportunities for rivals to engage in frontal or sideways competition, and especially sideways competition is much more important for disruptive innovation, to come up with a new product, service, activity that will dethrone the gatekeeper. So obligations such as the prohibition of MFNs or the ban on self-preferencing might allow new rivals to enter the scene and do different things, better things. So now, if we are to conceptualize the obligations of the DMA, we can see that both fairness and contestability can promote different types of innovation. Fairness is more attached to appropriating rents, appropriating the value of innovative activity, and in that way steering innovation, whereas contestability can promote incremental or disruptive innovation. So now, my final point is, what is the reason behind this analysis? What could be the takeaway of this analysis? So the different notions of innovation can perhaps help us rationalize or concretize the DMA obligations. As you saw in the previous slide, the same obligation might be perhaps inspired by fairness or contestability, we don't really know. But if we attach a particular content to this obligation and we connect it with a particular notion of innovation, we might be able to more properly concretize it. Also, this will allow the Commission to engage in an ex-post evaluation of performance. So did this particular obligation promote incremental innovation or not? And on top of that, I'm arguing that the innovation-inspired theories of harm that can be traced in the DMA can reinvigorate antitrust enforcement. So we can then use fairness and contestability in their relation to innovation to devise new theories of harm and perhaps offer a boost to antitrust enforcement. And simultaneously, the DMA or its omissions point towards a blind spot with regards to innovation. So one of the most important threats when it comes to gatekeepers is disruptive innovators. This can be easily eliminated through strategic acquisitions. So this is the DMA, by omitting to envisage a particular regime for strategic acquisitions, perhaps is suffering from a blind spot. What blind spot? A blind spot that can be identifiable, can be observable if we consider that disruptive innovation is a key player there and can be undermined by strategic acquisitions.
Stavros?
And with that,
I
I'm done.
okay. Cool. I know you were kind of like coming to an end, but I still wanted to be the obnoxious moderator.
In 15 minutes, right?
Yes, perfect timing. Thank you very much. Okay, so before we move on to Kris Erickson, can I just, I'm conscious of time and I know that we have about 15 to 20 minutes tops until the end of the panel. So can I encourage anyone who has questions, just put them in the chat. We'll try to kind of like synthesize or collate everything, just to make things a little more efficient, because I don't want to deprive Christopher of his full 15 minutes. So Kris, I'm going to fade in the background again, and the floor is all yours. And Kris, you're still muted. I don't know if you're trying to say anything, just a reminder.
Thank you. I hope you can all see my slides. So terrific. So my presentation is about this question that many of us are wondering about, which is what is going to be the effect of generative AI technology on competition and particularly within innovative and creative industries. So let's jump right into this and think about whether or not there's anything potentially disruptive coming down in terms of the way that this particular technology affects creative work. So I think what's interesting with generative AI that's maybe disruptive and is different from other let's say digitalization technologies, is that it opens up a possibility space of innovation in a really radical way. It allows us potentially to explore a very high volume of ideas, whether they're creative expressions or other sorts of ideas, very rapidly and at low cost, lowering every day. It also allows us to to automate the process of finding good ideas and then winnow them through simulating and testing and otherwise refining innovations and expressions. So the research question for this current paper that I'm working on, series of papers, is really what are the implications for innovation policy resulting from generative AI. And the literature that I'm drawing on is really this long trajectory of disruption that's occurred in creative and innovative markets. And that's just been brought about as a result of technological innovation and digital communication, internet, et cetera. And I think it's instructive to look back when it comes to generative AI. It's very instructive to look back to the turn of the millennium when we were talking a lot about zero marginal copies. So zero marginal copies were the ability to make a perfect digital example from a song or a film and distribute it instantaneously on the internet. And zero meaning that we could do so at almost no cost. There was still cost. And Richard Watt in his book actually quite helpfully explores the economics of that very thin margin, but nevertheless the small cost that pirates would endure. And it led, of course, commentators and researchers to explore this idea and to think about whether or not it was possible for incumbent firms to so-called compete with free, to appropriate value from their innovations, and whether this would result in market failure and the destruction of innovation. And there was lots of research and thought about whether or not intellectual property protection, private rights, had a role in protecting and preserving innovation in these industries. And some interesting empirical analysis about the approaches that were taken. On the other hand, we have this possibility that not all of the effects of digitalization are negative. And we have research, for example, by the economist Joel Waldfogel, pointing out that in some ways, from a consumer point of view, we're almost in a golden age, whereby the lowering costs of production as a result of digitalization has given us more choice. And so we're taking good and bad. But the point of this, and generally my sort of approach to the literature, is that whether or not we can situate this particular effects of generative AI in a longer trajectory of disruption It's not something super brand new. But I think what potentially is new is this effect of exploring an innovation space. So these two graphs, the one on the left is from Joel Waldfogel's research, and it's about the quantity of new products, in that case, television, but you could make the same graph for music, for film, for anything. That since the 1960s, there's just been this massive increase in the new television shows. As we've had more digital channels to be filled with content, more and more content has been made to fill those channels. So counterintuitively to the pessimistic argument, digitalization has allowed us to make more, not less, creative expressions. And the chart on the right is the results of a paper that examined Microsoft's internal R&D approach to trying to find incremental improvements to its Bing search engine. And what it found, these are the results of all of the tests and experiments that Microsoft ran on their product. And actually what you notice is that down in the right-hand corner of the distribution, so 0.1, 0.3, those were the small number of experiments that the company ran that actually yielded benefit to its product. All the rest of the experiments either yielded no measurable benefit or sometimes negative benefits. So this is just to show that the gems, in this sort of possibility space understanding of innovation are sometimes hidden in the corner of the distribution. And in order to find those, we have to run a lot of tests. So if we combine this concept that digitalization reduces the cost of production, we can create a lot of ideas, or we can explore a lot of ideas, and some of them are going to be really good, then with generative AI, we have both a qualitative and a quantitative disruptive mechanism that could introduce new challenges to creative industries. So some questions remain about, for example, the quality. We currently, in some platforms, live in a world of what's been called content sludge. This is just algorithmically produced content, which is very low value, but there's lots of it. There's almost too much of it to manage. And this new concept of zero marginal content, I prefer zero marginal creativity, which is essentially, it costs very little to spin up a new version, a new expression using generative AI, and that this a flood of content is going to create potential issues. So one example of where we might see some intellectual property and competition implications is in using generative AI to create many versions of an existing work. This is a real example from Twitter. It's a hacker who used various AI systems to make a fake movie trailer for Star Wars, but set in the 1920s as a silent film. And all of the characters, all of the movement, all of the sound was created using various prompts. So if this is possible now, that we can create a new version of an existing and beloved intellectual property, then what's going to happen when this is in the hands of everybody and we can all make our own bespoke version of a IP? We could make our own personal word processor. And then so the monopoly position, or in the media side, the sort of the hit, the blockbuster hit, is challenged by a million different variations that better suit the particular niche audience, which is using AI in order to create their version of things. So consensus reality starts to fall apart as a result of this. Just to close, I think, with my conclusions, and if you're interested in this, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to share with you a preprint and a longer version of the paper. But essentially, I think the main takeaway is that this really challenges the standard story of private rights as a reward for investment of labor. When labor approaches zero and we have a massive oversupply of innovations and expressions, we have a problem perhaps of overproduction, and the associated issues of search and retrieval and finding the actually good and useful innovation within a sea of them. When it comes to follow-on innovation, when it's possible to cheaply spin up an alternative which invents around an existing IP license, whether that's a copyright or a patent or something else, then inventing around becomes way more appealing, because we don't have to pay a license if we can just instantly create our own competing word processor that solves all of our needs. We don't have to pay Microsoft. Enforcement and search become really challenging for rights holders if there's a massive proliferation of this kind of activity to locate, detect, and enforce rights. And this sort of problem of this breakdown of consensus standards. What I think is likely to happen if we think about media and copyright material is that this disruption is likely to occur for mediums and genres where the consensus reality is less important. I mean, FIFA and live sporting events are not going to be challenged by generative AI, but where you have individual asynchronous consumption of like old TV shows or films or books, those kinds of media are more likely, I think, to be affected by this problem of sort of massive overproduction and you know, divergence from a single core primary text. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions or reply to people offline.
All right. Thank you very much, Kris. So we have a couple of minutes before we need to wrap up the panel. I don't see any questions in the chat, which means that our speakers have been abundantly clear in their presentations. But that doesn't mean that we cannot open up a floor. So if any of the attendees or any of the panelists, if so you wish, want to ask any questions to the other panelists, then please do feel free so. If that's not the case, I'm still monitoring, so don't worry if you have any last minute thoughts. But if not, there are two things that I was kind of try to do. One is that kind of like a very short point of clarification in Kris' presentation in the conclusion on whether you think, Kris, that the challenges for copyright are kind of like a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense that, like, are they going to move copyright policy into a welcome direction, or are they going to break it? So that's one kind of like quick reaction point there. And then if I can ask you, the rest of the panelists, and again, assuming that there are no questions from the audience, in literally one sentence, if you have any reactions to what was said in the panel, in the room today, you can raise your hand and, you know, give us your quick reaction to any of that. So, Kris, if I can just like give you
I can very quickly respond to that. I think that the incumbent legacy media rights holders will reach for copyright as a potential lifeboat to protect them and their IP, but it's perhaps not going to be the most useful policy lever for them to try to use. And maybe competition, maybe other kinds of appropriability or appropriation strategies might be what they need to rely on, rather than simply IP protection. Because as we've seen, the enforcement and search costs skyrocket, and so it may be that they're faced with just an impossible challenge to try to protect and enforce their rights.
Great. Thank you. Any other reactions, thoughts, comments, or questions from the rest of the panel? Okie doke. If that's the case, then Vinicius, can I yield back to you?
Yes, I just want to thank you very much for everyone. Konstantinos, Stavros, Amy, Aline, Kris, and everybody at Glasgow. As Glasgow is in my heart the best competition law team in the world, and will ever be. So congratulations on another great presentation from each one of you, and thanks very much for taking part in our conference.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. I hope to visit Brazil soon.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
See you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.